Thanks, Jim. Mineral advice in ruminants, are we getting it right? I think we could probably argue that that's a little bit of a leading question, and you'd probably be right. When I applied to do a Nuffield scholarship, I was pretty sure that the answer to that question was a firm no. After many years in the industry and academically, as Jim said, I've seen plenty of instances on farm of really poor advice given about mineral nutrition and seen numerous examples of problems caused by inadequate mineral balancing. What I really wanted to understand was why. Is this a problem limited to the UK and Europe, where my experience was? And finally, and probably most importantly, what can we do about it? I set out with a list of objectives. Firstly, to evaluate ruminant nutrition on a global scale. So to visit countries where I knew very little about ruminant nutrition in those countries, like Japan, but also to visit companies like the USA, Canada, and New Zealand. We take a lot of research from those countries, and I really wanted to see if it was applicable to UK farming systems. Secondly, I wanted to assess the complexity of balancing minerals. How difficult is it really to get that right on farm? Thirdly, evaluate how we may improve on farm advice. To do that, I wanted to step out of my world of just mineral nutrition and step into other ideas of knowledge transfer on farm. What does good advice look like? Who's a trusted advisor? Does that vary between different countries? Why does it vary? Why do farmers choose to trust certain people and not others? Is it based on qualifications, reputation, the relationship that that farmer already has with those people? And I really wanted to understand how we leverage those trusted advisors to make positive change on farm. Now, I know mineral nutrition is a pretty niche topic, especially for the last presentation, so I'm absolutely not going to go through the difference between formulating for a dairy cow, a beef animal, or small ruminants, as Rachel and Cormac have spoken about. Instead, I'm going to focus on 4 key concepts that indicate why I think it's really difficult to give good on-farm advice in this area. So starting with data and how useful it is. Secondly, looking at how certain we are about mineral requirements. Thirdly, this kill them with kindness, more is better concept that we often see in mineral nutrition. And lastly, the power of the phrase, I don't know, when it comes to on-farm advice. So starting with data, turning data into information. I was really lucky on my travels to get welcomed onto so many farms. I think in New Zealand, over 4 weeks, I covered around 45 farms, and it would be a similar number when I was in the USA. Now, I said my topic was niche, so what really surprised me was the number of farmers that when they found out the topic of my study, asked if I wanted to see the data. I have looked at so much analysis of silage, of grass, for minerals, and lots of veterinary diagnostic information. But what was a much grayer area was how people were actually using this data. How were they taking that data and turning it into actionable insight on farm? Data is only useful if we turn it into information. We turn that into insight, and that insight is used as an action. I saw some great examples of this, but one of them is shown on this slide. So this is a silage analysis from New Zealand. It looks a little bit different to the silage analysis you might be used to seeing in the UK. It still identifies the concentration of minerals in that silage, but it puts it on a scale, and it puts it on a scale alongside animal nutrition desired. Now, we might argue whether those absolute numbers are correct, but I think this is a really great example of a step forward in turning that data into information. The farmer can then use these numbers alongside their advisors to put a supplementation plan together that is based on real-life data from that farm. Now, why might we argue about the numbers? That's because for a lot of minerals, we have a relatively high level of uncertainty about requirement. The new guidelines for dairy cows were published by NASM in 2021, and they break minerals down into those where they state a requirement, those where they state a value of adequate intake, and those where they state a response. That is in relation to how certain we are about the numbers. If a requirement is stated, it means that we've got confidence in the data to state an absolute number that will meet the needs of 50% of the cows in that population. Adequate intake means we've got less certainty. We know that they require this mineral, but we're not so sure about the amount. And response is even less than that. We know animals respond to those minerals when supplemented. Now, there's lots of reasons why we have uncertainty, but one of them is related to the amount of research that's being conducted. That's what this graph shows. So those that are circled in red are the minerals where we state a requirement. The axis on the graph illustrates the proportion of total mineral research that has been conducted on each individual mineral. Now, what we can see is it's not perfect, but we've got quite a strong correlation. When more research is done, we're more certain about cow requirement. This graph also illustrates something else really nicely, and that is that there's much more research done in dairy, which is shown in the dark blue, compared to beef, which is in the light blue. I was really lucky when I was in the US. This is definitely a little bit of a fangirl, because if you have to be really into your mineral nutrition to know who this is. But this is Professor Bill Weiss. He was the primary author on the new guidelines for dairy cows. If you're a ruminant nutritionist, you'll be very familiar with this big textbook. But I asked him one really simple question. If I feed a cow based on the guidelines in this textbook, can you guarantee me that that cow will never have a mineral problem? He laughed and said, absolutely not. Don't do that. We can't guarantee that. If you do that, we're basing this on averages. It's much more complex than that. There are so many variables that affect how a cow will respond to those minerals. But that answer, I think, is a really clear indication of why it's really difficult to get good on-farm advice, because it's so complex. Unfortunately, when uncertainty happens, human nature is naturally wary. I don't think there's many people in this room that would say uncertainty is a happy place to be. And where I think we see that leaking into mineral nutrition is this more is better approach. People are more worried about undersupply, animals becoming deficient, and the poor performance associated with that than they are about oversupply. But actually, both of those situations are undesirable and should be avoided where possible. To illustrate that, you're going to have to give me a minute or two on my favorite mineral, which is copper. I've spent a lot of my career looking at copper nutrition, and for as long as I've been in the industry, we've had a copper oversupply issue in UK dairy cows. I've spoken to lots of nutritionists on my travels, and this is an issue that has been going on for over a decade. What I really wanted to understand was why. We know that cows that are oversupplied with copper have negative consequences, but we're still not being able to make a change as an industry. You could take this quote as a pretty brutal reason why. People are unwilling to adjust due to a lack of confidence in their own understanding and therefore being unable to justify when challenged. Pretty harsh, but I think probably a little bit true. People are looking for absolutely unequivocal evidence that nothing bad will happen if they make a change. Unfortunately for copper, we can't guarantee that. If cows become copper deficient, that does have negative repercussions. But the data is telling us, all the latest research is telling us, that oversupply is much more of a problem. We have to get better at translating the latest data and research into practice. I was so impressed with this when I was in the USA. The ability that their academics have of taking research and driving real change on farm was probably the best that I saw in the world. So finally, what does good advice look like? I could probably do a whole presentation just on this topic, but I'm going to focus on one key concept, and that's the power of the phrase, "I don't know." Many farmers on my travels commented that advisors, whether they were vets, consultants, nutritionists, always felt that they had to know the answer. And actually, if they had been unknown, they would have preferred them to say, "I don't know," or "I'll find out," or "I know somebody who knows that." It's really well understood in psychology that "I don't know" presents intellectual curiosity, humility, and builds trust in the person asking the question. So if you're an advisor on farm, I would really encourage you to know your niche, stay in your lane, and not be afraid to say to somebody, "I don't know the answer to that question." Ultimately, that builds trust and gives us better on-farm advice. So to conclude, we must turn data into information and into action on farm. There's still a lot of uncertainty about mineral requirements of ruminants, but there's also lots of research that we're not translating into practice. The science in this area will continue to evolve, and we've got to find a way to translate that into on-farm change. Hopefully, I've illustrated just in this very brief period that it is complex, and there's power in saying, "I don't know." Nuffield has given me the opportunity to travel all over the world, and I'm really lucky that now I get to build my consultancy, which was primarily just in the UK and Ireland, now doing a lot of work in the USA and Canada, and feel very lucky to be able to do that. All of this was made possible by the Richard Laws Foundation, so I'd like to say a huge thank you to them and to Nuffield for the opportunity.